Start here for now. The Labour Department has published new rules for managing COVID-19 in the workplace when the state of disaster is lifted. And one of the new rules include reaffirming employers' rights to introduce vaccine mandates in which employees may refuse to get the jab. Thembinkosi Mkhaliphi, the Department of Labour's Deputy Director General, joins us now to talk about this. And DDG, thank you so much for your time and good morning to you. I think before we get clarity on what the rules actually say, the new rules, and what exactly they are, let's talk about the intention behind these rules and what they means to be or to do for both the employer and the employee within the workplace.
I think the first thing we need to explain is that these rules are nothing new. Remember the minister a year ago published directive that allow to give employers what is it that they need to do in the workplace to fight against COVID. And one of those was the issue of a mandatory vaccination. Now, what we're doing is we're making sure that when the state of disaster is lifted, we've got rules that the labor market will follow. So that, because as you know, when it's lifted, the directive that were issued would be null and void because they were issued in terms of that state of disaster. That's the reason. Therefore, these regulations, not regulation and the code that we've published, take everything that was in the directive into the code of good practice. And it's doing simple, it's protecting workers. What is it workers need to do if they are caught up with COVID? And what is it employers need to do? It's making it clear, protecting workers and employers. And remember, employers have got a responsibility in terms of the Occupational Health and Safety Act to make sure that workers in the workplace are protected, and not only workers, even visitors to the company, the public who enter the company's premises are protected. Right. And therefore, these codes that we publish allow that employers should have policies, they should have risk. They must analyze the situation in their company and say, what are the risks that are facing workers and what are the risks that are facing the public, and what mitigations should they take to deal with those? That's what all this about.
So with that being said, DDG, how do you respond then to criticism that it seems the new code, or rather the codes, as you've mentioned, the rules which you say are not necessarily new, how do you respond to criticism that it seems they are biased to the employer because they strengthen the employer's rights to request a vaccination status from their employees, but also at the same time limits the grounds with which employees may refuse to get vaccinated?
Well, it doesn't strengthen the ground. It says employers must do a risk assessment. On the basis of that risk assessment, and also when they do a risk assessment, they go to consult with employees. If as part of that risk assessment, the result is that in that establishment, they've got to vaccinate. And that's what the assessment says. Obviously, if employees have got a reason not to vaccinate, they must present those reasons. Or if employees want to challenge the assessment itself, they can challenge the assessment itself. Therefore, the regulations, the code is not giving the employers a right on anything other than saying employers are required to do a risk assessment. On the basis of that risk assessment, then they can make calls on whether employees should produce a vaccine certificate or should not. And as employees who are not able to do that and they've got valid reasons are protected by the same code.
Yeah. So just for clarity's sake,
but if they don't have a valid reason,
right? Yes. Continue your point, DDG.
No, what I'm saying, if they don't have a valid reasons not to vaccinate, not to produce a certificate, then and they still refuse, they'll have to face the consequences of their decisions.
Yeah, and what are those consequences, DDG?
Well, the consequences it will depend on the company's policy. If the company's policy says, and the risk assessment that they've done, you cannot work here if you cannot show that you have vaccinated, then that will be the consequences for those who are refusing without any valid reason.
All right. So on what grounds then can an employee refuse to get vaccinated?
Well, one of them, it could be that they've got a doctor's report that says if they do vaccinate, it will have a negative effect on their health. That's one of the reasons that they can put in and produce that doctor's report.
All right. Before I have to give this question, pose this question to you before I let you go. With the few seconds I have left with you, I know that the CCMA has been inundated with complaints from employees regarding their employers either suspending or dismissing them for lack of adhering to those vaccine mandatory policies within the workplace, or even producing, those vaccine certificates. So on the employer side, what would it take for the employer before reaching a decision like that, so the employee understands that it's not an overnight decision that the employer takes, is one which has taken very serious considerations into consequences for both the employer and the employee? So briefly take me through then how the employer gets to that decision before suspending or even dismissing an employee for not producing that vaccination certificate.
Well, the first step is for the employer to do a risk assessment. What are the risks in this company of people catching COVID in terms of their work? That risk assessment must be consulted with employees. And that risk assessment then will develop into a policy if the result of the assessment says they've got to be a certification and vaccination in the company. And then consult with employees. And then if an employee breach that a policy that they've developed, then the disciplinary process starts.
All right. Well, we'll have to leave it then. I appreciate you speaking to us this morning. Thembinkosi Mkhaliphi, Department of Labour's Deputy Director General. Thank you so much, DDG, for your time.